All right. Hello, Professor Chomsky. Can you hear us? Thank you so much for generously taking the time to meet with us. But beforehand, I just want to give a short introduction. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Pokagon band of the Potawatomi. And I'd just like to give a short introduction about Noam Chomsky, who is one of the most influential and important thinkers of our time, as well as one of the most cited scholars. He's considered by many as the father of modern linguistics, and he has led the cognitive revolution, which radically transformed many different fields, not limited, but including linguistics, psychology, philosophy, and so much more. But more importantly, he has been one of the most foremost critics of American imperialism and state capitalism, and he has inspired countless activists around the world, including us here at Solidarity ND, by always being an invaluable voice for the voiceless, calling out and condemning injustices, and tirelessly advocating for human rights and basic human decency. So it's for that reason that we are incredibly elated and grateful that he has generously taken the time to speak with us about student activism here at Notre Dame. Here to introduce the event is Tianle Zhang.
Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Tianle Zhang. I'm a junior majoring in philosophy and the program of liberal studies. I'd like to express my gratitude to the program and to Dr. Eric Bogish, our advisor, for facilitating this event through the department, and of course to Dr. Chomsky for sparing the time to engage in dialogue with us today. However, it should be noted that the original motivation for this dialogue arose not as a top-down initiative from the department. Rather, it began as a series of conversations between members of our Democratic Socialist student group here at Notre Dame, Solidarity ND. Conversations which centered on our collective hope of learning lessons from past movements so as to apply them to the struggles of today. Hence, the theme of our dialogue today is student activism, and it is my sincere hope that future radicals who find themselves here at Notre Dame, be they undergraduates, graduate students, or faculty, will be able to return to this dialogue as an eminently practical resource, as an aid in reflecting upon a few concrete questions facing the student movement. In his classic 1967 essay, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, Dr. Chomsky opens with a retrospective. He recalls rereading a series of articles published by an activist intellectual of the previous generation, Dwight MacDonald, who posed one such concrete question, which, despite being first written in the 40s, has lost none of its significance today. Perhaps now is an appropriate time to revisit it once again. As intellectuals, in Dr. Chomsky's words, as intellectuals who have a responsibility to speak the truth and to expose lies, as intellectuals who are in a position to expose the lies of governments, to analyze actions according to their causes and motives and often hidden intentions, and as intellectuals always given the option to either produce or to critique the ideology of powerful social institutions, we must always ask ourselves, what have I done? For MacDonald during the Second World War, what have I done? For Chomsky during the Vietnam War, what have I done? And for those of us confronted with that very same question today, what have I done? I hope that this dialogue will, in a small way, contribute to each of us finding that answer for ourselves. The format for the dialogue will be simple. Over roughly the next hour, we will pose questions to Dr. Chomsky that arose from our student-led discussions over two of his seminal articles from the late 60s and early 70s. The Responsibility of Intellectuals, as I mentioned earlier, as well as In Defense of the Student Movement, written in 1971. And if there is enough time, we'll also open up the discussion to audience questions. Dr. Chomsky, thank you again so much for joining us today. My first question to you is this. In your latter essay, In Defense of the Student Movement, you urged the students and faculty to understand that freedom in the university exists, but is very badly misused, that these places are relatively free, decentralized institutions in which serious discussions are very largely made by faculty and very largely at the departmental level. From this analysis, you argue that students and faculty have the freedom to either put their talents to the service of powerful institutions of society, or to resist and to organize for things like radical scholarship and abstention from war. However, three things have happened since 1971 to dramatically change the structure of the university. First, the rapid increase in tuition, which has saddled students with debt, thereby reducing their freedom to organize, Second, the rapid restructuring of the university labor force, increasing the amount of adjuncts, decreasing tenure tracks, and generally making academic labor much more precarious. And third, the rise of the administrative class, which has taken agency away from students and faculty. Given these conditions, would you still characterize the university as a place of relative freedom for students and faculty today? Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, I should mention that these developments that you describe quite accurately are part of something far broader. They're part of the whole reactionary wave. Began at the level of discussion and ideology in the 1970s and began in policy terms in the late 70s, early 80s. It's the whole neoliberal reaction, which sought to, among other things, to undermine the activism of the 60s and the civilizing effect that it had on the society. That caused a lot of concern among elites across the political spectrum. I don't know if you've read it, but if you haven't, I'd suggest that you take a look at a book called The Crisis of Democracy, which appeared in 1975. It's a reflection, it's an expression of the views of the liberal internationalists, basically the Carter administration, which was in the US, a group drawn from this organization. It's the Trilateral Commission, liberal and nationalist internationalists of United States, Europe, Japan, basically Carter in the United States. The rapporteur for the American delegation was Samuel Huntington, who was professor of political science at Harvard, a kind of a Kennedy liberal. They are the crisis of democracy that they saw was that in the 60s, there was too much activism. Too many people, young people, departed from their normal stance of passivity and obedience, tried to enter the political arena to press their demands. Women, young people, labor, farmers, basically the whole population. And that was caused a problem they felt. Remember, I'm speaking at the liberal end of the spectrum. The problem is it's too much pressure on the state. It can't respond to all these demands. So therefore, we should have more, called for more moderation in democracy. Go back and be quiet and passive and don't disrupt things. With regard to the universities, it said the problem of the universities is that it referred to the universities as the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. That's the universities. They're responsible for the indoctrination of the young. They haven't been doing their job. That's why you see these young people in the streets opposing the Vietnam War, calling for women's rights in general, moving into domains in which they don't belong. Therefore, it called for improving the universities so as to not allow these possibilities. Well, that was the expression of a very general view. It was much harsher on the right. You can find it in the Powell Memorandum, which you can find on the internet. That's the right-wing counterpart to this. But it set in motion the processes that you described. Tuition started going up. Business models were imposed on the schools and universities, more rigid curricula, teaching to test, defunding, radical defunding, especially of state colleges and universities. All of these developments that have gone on in the last 40 years. The goal is to improve the indoctrination of the young and to keep people like you where you belong, in your seats, not interfering in the affairs of the world, not demonstrating about climate change, nuclear war, whatever happens to concern you. So it's not, and it was associated with policy actions that actually began in the late Carter administration, but took off under Reagan, called neoliberalism, actually a form of pretty savage class war, what we've been living with for the last 40 years. All of this is of a piece. So these things didn't just happen. They were planned, organized, all fit together in a very general pattern. It's a kind of massive class war to try to restore the domination of the traditional powerful classes, including the intellectual groups that serve them, put an end to this disruption and nuisance of people trying to press their demands in the political arena to change policies. Well, nevertheless, despite all this, what you quoted before remains true. By comparative standards, the universities remain quite free. We're free to have this meeting. You're not going to have stormtroopers come in and grab you, take you away. You can have, I teach courses at the University of Arizona now. I used to teach at MIT, but I teach courses freely on social and political issues. The legislature in Arizona doesn't like it. A lot of the faculty doesn't like it, but they don't stop it. That's an arena of relative freedom, which we can do lots of things. Now we've seen it. It's had an effect. So if you take a look at the major issues of the day, nothing more important than destroying the climate. Who's out in the lead trying to do things about it? Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, Global Climate Strike, young people mostly from colleges and universities. So it remains the center for activism as it's was in the 60s, and it very commonly is. If you look through history, it's often the case that people basically of your age and position have been in the lead in activist work to try to improve the world. And it's not too surprising if you think about it. This is the period of a person's life in which they're most free, most independent, out of parental control, not yet in a position where you have to worry about putting food on the table. Well, it's a position of relative freedom, free to explore, to inquire. It's a good special time of life. It's quite right that it should lead to activism and engagement in affairs of the world. And it's quite understandable that liberal elites would be upset about the failure to indoctrinate the young, which is the task of the universities as they see it. So this is a conflict that goes on persistently. It takes different forms, and it remains the case, luckily for us, that the universities are an arena of considerable freedom and opportunity. Good chance to make use of it.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for your answer. So my question is, in your essay in defense of the student movement, you discuss how the university is politicized by its association with repressive institutions, which you identified as the result from the national psychosis that had developed during the Cold War. My question is, how has this implicit politicization manifested itself during today's post-Cold War era? For example, the corporatization of education and the entrenchment of ROTC programs. Furthermore, what are some ways to combat these new forms of politicization of the university?
The way to combat it is by using the freedom that the university offers. Make use of that freedom to organize, to try to achieve the kind of educational programs that you think are appropriate, that you want, to foster the kind, to give a place for the kind of activism that will be committed to dealing with the crises of the world. I should say that we're in a different position today than we were when this discussion that you're quoting took place. There were very serious problems then, very serious. Nothing like what we have today. Today, we have crises of a kind that have never arisen in human history, never. And if we don't answer them, deal with them, it'll be the end of human history. It's not just my judgment. Take a look at the famous doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I'm sure you're familiar with it. The doomsday clock was established shortly after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The hands of the clock were set a certain distance from midnight. Midnight means essentially termination of organized human life on Earth. And every year, every January now, analysts, scientists, political analysts, and so on, get together, try to give a general assessment of the world security situation and set the hands of the doomsday clock accordingly. 1947, they were set at 7 minutes to midnight. 1953, they moved to 2 minutes to midnight. That's when the United States and the Soviet Union exploded thermonuclear weapons, which showed that human intelligence had reached the point where it could destroy everything. After that, it's been oscillating depending on assessments of the world situation. In the Trump administration, it went back for the first time to 2 minutes to midnight, 2018. The next year, still in the Trump administration, the analysts abandoned minutes, moved to seconds. It's now set now at 100 seconds to midnight. In January, I anticipate that they may move the second hand even closer to midnight. I think that's a pretty fair assessment of where we stand. They identified 3 major issues. One is the traditional issue of the threat of nuclear war, now increasing. Second is the existential threat of heating of the atmosphere, getting worse. And the third is the collapse of an arena for rational discussion and debate. First, that may not sound like it belongs with the first two, but it does, because that's the only hope for dealing appropriately with the major crises. And that's your situation today. The universities are the most appropriate, supportive place for creating an arena of free rational discussion and debate. They should be in the lead in this. They provide opportunities not found elsewhere. Shouldn't be the only places. All kinds of other associations, labor movement, other groups should be involved. But the universities have a preeminent position, and they are now, that means you are now facing the kinds of questions that did not arise in the early 70s, serious as the times were then, and that have never arisen in human history. These issues will be resolved in the next generation or never. That's quite a challenge that's never arisen before. And like it or not, it's the challenge you have to face under situations circumstances which are not ideal, but do offer plenty of opportunities.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, Dr. Chomsky. My name is Huiram Jeong, and I'm from South Korea, and I'm majoring in political science. So you wrote that the search for confrontation clearly indicates intellectual bankruptcy, that in reality, the idea of confrontation tactics is often a confession of the inability to develop effective politics or the unwillingness to do the serious and hard work of social reconstruction that can easily be condemned as reformist. However, in my experience, even without searching for confrontation by engaging in activism or without engaging in activism, in like recently in Korea, the President Yoon, he tried to enact the presidential decree that presidential security service control the police and military service too. So like this one, like the confrontation, eventually we will encounter confrontation from the police. So how should student activists act when they encounter rather than seek or searching confrontation? Thank you.
I don't think there's any general answer to such questions. And I think the specific answers simply have to be given by people who are on the scene, familiar with existing circumstances, in a position to evaluate the likely consequences of what they do. Any kind of activism, the first question you ask is, what am I trying to achieve? Well, it could be many different things, but if what I'm trying to achieve is to bring other people to join me in the kinds of things I'm trying to do, we have to ask how my actions are going to affect that. Are my actions going to alienate them and drive them away? Or will my actions inspire them or encourage them to participate in some form in what I'm trying to achieve? There's no general answer to that question. There's no absolute right or wrong about it. You have to adjust the actions to the circumstances and to the goals you're trying to achieve. And the answers have to be given with people who have set those goals and are in a position to evaluate well the likely consequences of what they do. But there's no textbook answer. I could give you examples from the past, which are quite striking. These questions have always arisen. Let's go back to the period you're talking about, around 1970. think what the issues were then. There were many, but one of the dominant issue was the destruction of Indochina. Indochina was being virtually destroyed by the United States. The leading historian of Vietnam, highly respected in government circles, leading Vietnam historian, military historian, Bernard Fall, no Dove, incidentally. A couple of years earlier, 1967, he wrote that he wondered whether Vietnam could survive as a cultural and historical entity under the blows of the most powerful and destructive military machine ever launched against an area this size. I was talking about the American war, primarily against South Vietnam, partially against the North, by then already in Cambodia and Laos. That was 1967. We're talking about 1970, got much worse. Well, at that time, a lot of people your age, young people, felt this is so horrendous. We just can't sit by and just talk about it and have peaceful demonstrations about it. We have to do more. We have to smash the place up. We have to march down Main Street and break windows. We have to confront power violently. Weathermen, it's the weather underground. Many kids I knew very well, very good people, very sincere, very honorable, destroyed themselves, harmed the movement. That's not all that they succeeded in doing, was encouraging support for the war. Well, that's what your feelings are not enough. You have to ask what the consequences are of your action. I should say at about the same time, I was attending meetings of South Vietnamese women mostly. Couldn't come to the United States, of course, but we met in Paris. They met with peace activists. And the kind of acts that they proposed and encouraged were so mild that American activists would have laughed at them. So I remember one person, these are people coming, remember, from a country that is being wiped out, devastated by hideous terror. Things you read about, like the My Lai massacre, were icing on the cake. They were almost nothing like what was happening. Horrendous atrocities. They're coming and telling us what they want us to do. And I said what really impressed them was when a group of American women stood silently at the graves of fallen American soldiers. That's what they thought was really impressive, because they were not concerned with how we felt. They wanted to survive, and to survive meant bringing the general American population into agreement to end these horrifying atrocities. Well, these are the kinds of questions that constantly arise. Not enough to feel good, you have to do good. That's what matters. And that requires sensitive attention to the likely consequences of the actions you undertake.
Good afternoon, Professor. You observed in the defensive student movement that any serious movement for social change will have to involve many different strata of the population, including many groups who are in no position even to articulate their goals and needs, and certainly not to bring them to public attention or develop political action based on them. With the goal of the student movement attempting to understand and articulate these goals, to try to persuade and organize, and ultimately to act collectively where they can, individually if it comes to that, what are the ways that students can begin to approach different social groups, particularly in a campus like Notre Dame, where we are so isolated from the local community. And furthermore, with the danger of paternalism and students claiming to speak for a community, especially from our own privileged positions as students.
Just think of how students have done in the past in many interesting ways. Let's go back to a little earlier than we've been discussing. Let's go back to 1960, early days of the civil rights movement. What were students doing? Well, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, young students, mostly Black in the South, were riding freedom buses, no joke, endangering themselves. Some were killed going through places like Alabama and Georgia, trying to encourage Black farmers to take their fate in their hands and register to vote, which could have meant death, and support them in these activities. They weren't paternalistic. They were engaging with the poor and the oppressed and seeking to provide the services that they could to them. Let's go a couple of years further. Take the 1980s. The 1980s were the time of the most, my view, the most important popular activist movement ever. So important that it's been wiped out of history. Students were heavily involved in it. I'm talking about the Central America solidarity movements. The United States at the time was at war with Central America. Ronald Reagan was carrying out horrendous terrorist wars throughout Central America. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, many more, almost 1 million, tortured, driven out of their homes, every imaginable form of atrocity that you can think of. The United States was even brought to the World Court and charged with international terrorism. Of course, it rejected it. Americans did protest, but in a novel way, something that had never happened before. Thousands of people here, many young people, my daughters, to give 2 examples, but many others, went to live with the victims, to work with them, to try to support them, to try to help them, even to give them the kind of limited protection that you get when there's a white face and the state terrorists, they're all state terrorists, army, security forces, paramilitaries. Let's back off a little bit. Well, some were killed, some suffered. That had never happened before in history. Nobody during the Vietnam War ever thought of going to live in a Vietnamese village to try to provide some help and protection to the people under attack. During the French wars in Algeria, also hideous atrocities like all colonial wars. Nobody in France, there was protest, but nobody went to live with Algerian villagers. And it was all over the country. From Notre Dame as well, I remember groups, church groups, evangelical churches, churches in Midwest and Kansas and rural Maryland, from all parts of the country were carrying out these remarkable activities, remarkable engagement. Wasn't patriarchal. It was going to work with people, help them, give them the kind of help that people who are more privileged, who have skills, who have education, things that they can do that a poor villager can't do. Well, these are the kinds of things that can be done. It can be done in poor communities here. I've been in very poor communities where young people have gone to work, to live, to help, to try to organize, to try to build community actions, often with some success. So there's all kinds of things you can do. Doesn't have to, shouldn't be, can't be. I'm smarter than you, I'll tell you what to do, I'll be your voice, not that. I can help you, I have skills, I'm willing to be part of what you're doing. I'll learn from you, just as you'll learn from me, the way good education ought to be, a mutual interaction. All of those things are possible. They've been done in the past, they can be done right now, no matter where you are.
Thank you, Professor. Now I'm gonna pull up a video that was pre-recorded, and it's one of the questions that someone had that couldn't join us here today. But we couldn't quite get the audio transcription to work, so I'm just gonna send you the text of the question through a direct message as well.
See.
Hi, my name is Fabrice Uwihirwe. I am an economics and global affairs major with a minor in poverty studies, and I'm involved through Solidarity ND. And I'd just like to thank you again for coming today, Dr. Chomsky. So, you know, towards the end of In Defense of the Student Movement, you turned towards concrete ways in which students organized radical programs within the university. And among other examples, you mentioned the creation of, you know, radical and objective scholarship within the academy, as well as organizing scientists to refuse military work. So my specific question is, you know, what other creative and effective programs have you personally seen as a scholar and an activist during your time? Thank you.
Well, let's go back to those days, the early 70s. One of the things that happened was it's called the Student Action Coordinating Committee. A lot of it was at MIT, where I was a very active student body in those days. It was a group of young scientists, students, mostly young graduate students, physicists, engineers, decided to form, not just to refrain from military work, but to become directly engaged in what was called science for the people, using scientific knowledge, organization, to try to help peoples who could benefit from these activities. Many of them did so. Some of them went and formed a group called Union of Concerned Scientists, still exists, very lively and active. It's an activist group by now of senior scientists who play a very significant role in matters of disarmament, peace, other things where we're having scientific knowledge and does enable you to enter directly into influencing policy decisions. Others just went into communities. One grad student, physics friend of mine, went off to live in a community and happened to be in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. He went there as a teacher, basically, science teacher, trying to see what he could do in the community that would be helpful for organization. One of the things he discovered was that there seemed to be a lot of cancer in the community. He looked into it. He found out, he started a significant study using this Cape Cod Community College, bringing students and faculty into an inquiry to see what's the cancer problem. Well, what they discovered was quite interesting. Turns out that Cape Cod, the water in Cape Cod comes from an underground aquifer. Anything that poisons the aquifer will hit everybody. There's a military base there. Turns out the military base was spilling jet fuel and other pollutants, which went into the aquifer. As they did studies, they showed that the incidence of cancer depended on the flow of the aquifer. So the closest you were to the military base, the higher the rate of cancer. They began an activist effort to try to compel the military base to end their activities, to end the pollution and destruction. Involved quite a lot of the community by then. Once the community was organized, they got involved in other activities too. And finally, I won't go through the whole story, but there was enough pressure to get the Secretary of the Air Force, who was actually an MIT graduate, to agree to impose sharp restrictions and end pollution, and even provide some, for the government to provide some means to cure the people who were harmed. This not only was a very important activity in itself, but it energized the communities to do other things. Well, that's one example of many of the kind of thing that young students in the sciences did at that time. Not just, let's not work on military work, but let's do something constructive with our capacities and abilities. And it's had a major effect. Ongoing significant groups like Union of Concerned Scientists, many activities throughout the world, throughout the country, also educational activities, courses dealing with how to apply with the social use of technology. Just to give you one example, the pressures within MIT, where I was, were so strong by student activism that the administration set aside a whole day, March 4th, 1969, I think it was, set one day aside, no classes, just for talks, seminars, meetings on the social use of technology. What are we doing with our technology? Are we using it to destroy or to help? MIT was a major military contractor, remember. This was very important. It set in motion. It was part of the way in which some of these organizations, it spawned some of these organizations, organized students to do things. That was all inside the university. Also led to a lot of changes in the academic curriculum, courses concerned with these things, and a strong shift in attitudes. These questions had never arisen before. 50s and 60s, starting until the late 60s, students just did their work. Faculty did their work. Practically nobody asked, what are we doing? Well, that was a big change. And it's had a spreading effect. You can do that right where you are. It was a small group of activists, maybe half a dozen of them, who started it. Many of them have continued this work for the rest of their lives, still are doing it. People like, if some of you are involved in the Z communications system organized by Michael Albert, he was the leading student at the time, still devoted his life to it in many other ways, many other activities, and there are others.
I'd like to ask one more question from our group before we open up to a few questions from the audience, if that's all right. So as this event was hosted by the Program of Liberal Studies, which emerged out of the Great Books movement, I would be remiss if I did not ask this last question. In the responsibility of intellectuals, you have an understanding of the traditional intellectual, the ideological type still concerned about irresponsible questions, such as the moral issues and human rights over the traditional problems of man and society, and who are thus still in a position to critique the excesses of American imperialism. However, this class is becoming endangered due to the emergence of the new breed of the scholar expert, who jealously guards their specialized knowledge as a way to protect their class position in reproducing state ideology. My last question is this: how should we understand and navigate this dichotomy today? And do the liberal arts have a progressive role to play in politics within this dichotomy?
The liberal arts should free your minds to inquire, to evaluate, to create, to understand the great contributions of the past, the great failures of the past, to think them through, to ask what we can do to carry forward understanding of the world, understanding of society, and find ways to change and improve the world. That's the role of the liberal arts. It's one of the reasons why the liberal arts are under attack. There's very strong pressure from right-wing elements around the country, in state legislatures and elsewhere, to undermine liberal arts and to direct students to basically vocationally oriented activities. Just take the kinds of courses that'll help you get a job and find your place within the established society, not the kind of courses that raise the kinds of questions that you just raised, not those things. We don't want students to be thinking for themselves. That's dangerous. That goes back to classical Greece, as far back as you can trace history. Go back to Athens, classical Greece. Ask yourself, who was the man who was forced to drink the hemlock and commit suicide? Socrates. What was his crime? His crime was disrupting the youth of Athens by asking them too many questions, by asking them to think about things. That's dangerous. When people start thinking about things, the structures of power begin to dissolve. Illegitimate hierarchies are challenged. You move forward towards a more free and just world. And the people who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, the people who run and own the world, they don't like that. To go back to my earlier comments, that's why liberal intellectuals in the early 1970s were criticizing I'm quoting again, criticizing the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young for failure to carry out these activities properly. Okay, that's the constant struggle. It's a kind of form of class struggle within the framework of the institution, of the educational institutions.
Thank you so much for that answer and for giving your time again for this dialogue. I was wondering if it would be possible just to ask to field one or two questions for you to answer one or two questions from the audience.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, so if anyone would like to just come up and ask some questions to Dr. Chomsky about student activism or any questions that you had that arose during this dialogue, please feel free. and introduce yourself.
Hello, Professor Dr. Chomsky. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. My name is Ikechukwu Anyanu, sophomore here. My question is, do you believe the liberties and freedom to think freely and engage in dialogues such as these are going to be challenged moving forward, per se, by like the government to try to restrict the voices of the youth?
You can see it happening right now. It's not hidden. The Republican Party, which has shifted far to the right, is trying very hard to restrict freedom of thought, limit the books you're allowed to read. They're cleansing libraries of books that they think might be subversive. You may recall that Toni Morrison was banned recently from some libraries because of right-wing pressure. Just today, I got an announcement that books, Art Spiegelman's book, Maus, other books on the Holocaust, have been driven out of libraries because parents are objecting to right-wing parents, very well organized by the far right, are trying to stop them from being used. It's not secret. It's all quite open. It's an effort to control thought. Trump administration, when he was still in office, released an edict saying that schools should not be able to teach, should not be allowed to teach material in American history, which makes students feel uncomfortable, that disturbs students, can't teach it. What does that mean? Not just for American history, but for the history of any country. Well, I don't have to bother telling you what it means. That's straight out of Stalinist Russia, straight out of Stalinist Russia and Hitler Germany. It's public, open. It's right in Notre Dame and other places. It's coming out of the right of the mainstream Republican Party. It's mainstream America. You can see these things right in front of your eyes. They're not hidden. They're presented quite proudly. And they're presented as defense of what's right and just. They're not, it's presented as the proper thing to do. If these elements gain more power in the country, we're going to see more of it. Something to struggle against, not to permit.
Hey, Dr. Chomsky. I'm Isaac. I'm a sophomore, and I had a question about the United States' role. It's a common question, but kind of threading the needle between being like having this moral responsibility to the rest of the world because of our wealth, but also not kind of repeating the mistakes of like the Reagan administration. I think you once said like the only justified war is World War II. So like, what's like your criteria for moral intervention in other countries?
Well, it depends what you mean by moral intervention. If moral intervention means censuring the Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, for his involvement in the murder of the journalist Khashoggi, that's fine. If it means condemning crimes of others, joining with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, that would be fine. I'd like to see it happen, not just against enemies and antagonists, but against our own allies, our own country. There's plenty to talk about here. So that's moral intervention. If you mean some other kind of intervention that involves any kind of force, it raises very serious questions. And here's something I think you ought to look into in carrying out inquiry. There is a category called, a concept called humanitarian intervention, really developed mostly in the 1990s, most which not by accident. After the fall of the Soviet Union, as long as the Soviet Union was around, there was an easy justification for any kind of intervention, any kind of atrocity, crime, aggression, violence, torture, always had a justification. The communists are coming, the Russians are coming, so you didn't need any arguments. Collapse of the Soviet Union was harder to appeal to that, and still try, but it doesn't have the appeal that it had before. So something new was needed. So all of a sudden, humanitarian intervention came along. Okay, we're still going to intervene, but it's going to be for humanitarian ends now. Well, actually, there is an interesting history of humanitarian intervention, and that's what I urge you to look into. Ask yourself a simple question. Has it ever happened? Has there ever been a case of authentic humanitarian intervention? That is, the use of force undertaken to prevent crimes and atrocities. Actually, there's scholarship on the topic in the legal scholarship. What you'll find is it's almost impossible to find an example. Almost every use of force by everyone is declared to be humanitarian. That goes back as far as you go. So when Hitler took over the part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, it was out of the goodness of his heart to prevent ethnic conflict, to bring to the people of Czechoslovakia the benefits of superior German civilization. When Japan in the 1930s was carrying out horrendous atrocities in Manchuria and China, rape of Nanking, other grotesque atrocities. Take a look at the Japanese literature. I've written about it. I wrote about it in the 1960s, if you want to look. It was overflowing with human kindness. We want to create an earthly paradise in China. Unfortunately, we have to protect the Chinese people from Chinese bandits, terrorists, namely the people who were resisting Japanese aggression. But it was just, and these incidentally are internal documents, not for the public. These are their own counterinsurgency documents. They're talking to each other. Believed it. If we had documents from Attila the Hun, we'd probably find the same thing. We find the same thing, I won't talk about it now, and among the leading British intellectuals, the most outstanding of them, people like John Stuart Mill, writing them, giving, talking about the magnificence of England as it carries out horrendous atrocities. You can find plenty of it here. I've given plenty of examples. So see if you can find an actual case of humanitarian intervention. It's very illuminating. Let's take the period since the Second World War. Actually, there are two cases that come to mind. You won't read about them because they're the wrong kind of cases. That's not what's given to you in a under proper indoctrination, but think about them. One case was in 1978. Vietnam invaded Cambodia. It drove out the Khmer Rouge. It ended their genocidal atrocities, drove them out. I wouldn't call it a humanitarian intervention because that was not their purpose. Their purpose was to defend Vietnam from attacks, border attacks by the Khmer Rouge. But the effect was to end the atrocities in Cambodia. How did the United States react? By bitterly condemning Vietnam, imposing sanctions on them, supporting the Khmer Rouge, determining that they're the legitimate government of Cambodia, supporting them in the United Nations, supporting a Chinese invasion to punish Vietnam for ending the rule of the Khmer Rouge. That's one example. A couple of years later, there was in Pakistan, the Pakistani army attacked what's now Bangladesh, which is then East Pakistan, again, carrying out monstrous atrocities. India intervened, stopped the atrocities, gave East Pakistan the chance for independence. It's now Bangladesh. How'd the US react? Same way. Bitter attacks against India, sanctions. Henry Kissinger was in charge, sent the American fleet to the Bay of Bengal to threaten the Indians for doing this. Main reason is it spoiled a photo op he was planning to set up by a trip to China, which went through Pakistan. Well, those are the two main examples of humanitarian intervention in recent history. You're not going to read about them unless you're taking a very unusual course, one that's concerned with the facts, not with indoctrination. There are cases that here are called humanitarian intervention, like the US invasion of Serbia, Kosovo in 1999. Claim is that this was done to prevent Serbian atrocities. It's probably what you read. Total lie. It's very well documented. There were European observers on the ground. We know exactly what happened. The atrocities were caused by the intervention. Furthermore, that was conscious. The Clinton administration was directly informed by the top general, Wesley Clark, NATO general, that if the United States bombed, it would lead to major atrocities. Went ahead and did it for their own reasons. Comes down in history as a humanitarian intervention to prevent atrocities. Well, that's effective indoctrination. The institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young and the general population are doing their job. You're in a position where you can freely inquire and investigate these things, not just accept what you're told. Okay, do it. I'm sure you can find the documentation right in the Notre Dame library. Same in general. So going back to your question, when is intervention proper? When it is undertaken to have a beneficial effect and has that effect. You'll be very hard pressed to find authentic examples. That's not the way power systems operate. There are occasional exceptions, but they're pretty rare. And remember, every use of force is justified that way, whether it's Japanese fascists, Nazis, anybody else. But you have to tear through the propaganda and see what's happening. Afraid I'm going to have to leave you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chomsky, for again spending this time with us and answering our questions. I think your presence here is a testament to the fact that how seriously you've taken up the responsibility of the intellectual. And yeah, I would just really thank you again for your time here with us today.
Thank you.